Did Keir Starmer just try to silence Britain's farmers and get humiliated in the process? One moment, the Labour leader was preaching green justice from his polished podium, and the next, Britain watched as the countryside erupted in fury. Tractors, blockaded cities, and a silent judiciary delivered a thunderous warning: back off or risk collapse. Starmer thought he could rewrite the rules of protest, property, and power. But then something happened that he never expected. Nigel Farage stepped in and stopped the arrests cold. Even King Charles is furious. Starmer didn't just miscalculate. He detonated a political firestorm. It started like any other quiet policy rollout, buried in legal jargon and dressed up in the language of fairness and climate responsibility. Labour's new inheritance tax proposal looked harmless to city elites. A 20% levy on farmland valued over $1 million. On paper, it was a minor adjustment. But outside Westminster's bubble, in the barns, fields, and on the muddy boots of the people who feed this country, it wasn't just an attack. It was a threat. For Britain's farming families, that land isn't just acreage. It's a legacy, a bloodline, passed from grandfathers to sons, from mothers to daughters. It's their home, their job, their history, all in one. And now Labour wanted a cut, a big one. Suddenly, if a farmer died, their children wouldn't inherit a way of life. They'd inherit a debt. Sell the land or lose everything. Starmer and his inner circle might have called it policy, but the countryside called it theft. But it didn't stop at the tax. As word spread, the countryside stirred. What started as whispers turned into meetings. Quiet frustration became public fury. And then the tractors rolled in. Parliament Square, Labour HQ, major highways across the Midlands and the South. Fields were abandoned as farmers took to the roads, not with weapons, but with banners, their harvest dumped in front of Labour offices. Signs read, "No farmers, no food. You tax our land, you starve your nation." And Starmer panicked. Instead of listening, he cracked down. Instead of negotiating, he called in the police. Instead of dialogue, he reached for control. Peaceful farmers were suddenly branded as agitators. Rural leaders found themselves under surveillance. Police began collecting names, tapping phones, and preparing charges. Behind closed doors, Labour officials whispered about strategic arrests. Protest organizers, some in their 60s, were warned, step back or be dragged out. Starmer didn't just lose the countryside, he declared war on it. That's when the judiciary stirred, and that's when the resistance got a face. Because in the chaos of panic policing, someone stepped forward, not from Labour, not from the Tories, but from the outside, from the populist fringe Labour despises and fears. Nigel Farage. Farage didn't walk into this fight. He stormed in. While Starmer's team scrambled to control the fallout, to spin the narrative, to label protesting farmers as disruptive elements, Farage took to the airwaves and tore the curtain down. He didn't mince words. He didn't hesitate. On GB News, at Reform UK rallies, across every platform that would take him. He exposed the entire operation for what it was, a government crackdown on dissent disguised as climate policy. This is a war on the countryside, he said. Economic cleansing, a state-led purge of the very people who feed us. And the country listened. Because while Labour was trying to criminalize tractors and rebrand farmers as extremists, Farage was calling it what every honest Brit could see: theft, suppression, the raw machinery of power spinning out of control. And that's when something extraordinary happened, something Labour never saw coming. The resistance jumped the fence from protest to power. Because while Farage was lighting fires in public, behind closed doors, a different kind of rebellion was brewing, one that shook the very foundations of Labour's control. Within the judiciary, a silent but seismic revolt began. Leaks started, dripping from high legal offices. Insiders revealed that senior judges were horrified by what was unfolding. One particularly damning leak exposed a warning from a top legal figure, anonymous for now but deeply connected. His message to Labour was blunt. What you're planning is unconstitutional, unlawful, and dangerous. Arresting farmers for protesting, taxes, monitoring their phones, tracking their movements, preparing to detain organizers preemptively, that's not law. That's tyranny. The phrase that echoed from that leaked memo hit like a thunderclap. Gross abuse of power. That wasn't the opposition speaking. That was the judiciary. The very institution tasked with protecting the law was now turning against the people who claimed to write it. Labor had gone too far. And now the checks and balances that Starmer hoped would stay silent were finally snapping into place. But Starmer, cornered and rattled, kept pushing. He doubled down on his message: climate justice, long-term responsibility, rebalancing the system. But it was too late. His words didn't match his actions. While he spoke of fairness, farmers were being detained. While he preached compassion, elderly landowners were being interrogated. While he bragged about clean energy and carbon targets, footage leaked of riot vans rolling into rural communities. And when reporters pushed for answers, Labor's response was cold. We are protecting the public. But the public didn't need protecting from farmers. They needed protecting from the government. And here's where Farage did something that changed the tide. He didn't just criticize, he mobilized. Reform UK began sending legal observers to protests. They launched a hotline for farmers facing police pressure. They published every leaked memo, every judicial warning, every internal labor message that exposed what was really happening. And suddenly, what Starmer thought would be a quiet suppression operation turned into a full-blown political earthquake. Journalists who had once ignored rural issues started digging. Civil liberties groups raised red flags. Labor's allies in the media, some of them, began to question the narrative. And within the party itself, a cold wind started to blow. Rural Labor MPs, few as they are, began to murmur. Backbenchers sent private messages to journalists expressing concern. Some quietly reached out to Reform UK figures for off-the-record conversations, and the cracks widened because the truth was undeniable. Labor had crossed a line. And once that line was crossed, once the party of workers and fairness had turned on the people who grow the food, who till the soil, who preserve the land, there was no turning back. Starmer's image, carefully built over years, began to crumble. His polished speeches, his loyal precision, his crafted moderation, all of it fell flat under the weight of rubber tires, protest signs, and legal indictments. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. And the people saw the face beneath it. Not a calm reformer, not a moderate, but a panicked technocrat, desperate to hold control over a nation that was slipping from his grasp. And Farage, he didn't just join the fight. He took it over. The countryside didn't calm down, it rose. By the third week of protests, it was no longer just a handful of tractors circling Parliament. It was a national uprising. Road after road, town after town, blocked, jammed, gridlocked. Farmers arrived not just from Kent and Norfolk, but from Wales, from Scotland, from the north. Some drove 10 hours overnight just to make their voices heard. Villages stood still as farmers left their work to join the front lines. Fields went untended. Livestock were left to roam because something bigger was happening than crops and cattle. This was no longer about tax. It was about survival, about dignity, about not being treated like criminals by the very people who claim to represent them. And this time, the country listened. Not just the countryside, but the nation. Videos of elderly farmers being dragged from protests went viral. Footage of labor staffers sneering at rural reactionaries made its way to the headlines. And when it emerged that internal labor memos described the farmers as security risks and uncooperative assets, the backlash erupted. Phone lines to Reform UK were flooded. Local councils across the South and Midlands began facing protests of their own, and then came the real blow. Labour's rural councillors started resigning, quietly at first, then publicly with long statements, denouncing the party's betrayal. Some switched to independent status. A few defected outright to Reform UK. Starmer tried to get ahead of it, holding press conferences, issuing scripted appeals, deploying soft language about dialogue and mutual respect. But it didn't work because the images told a different story. Farmers being kettled by police, protesters being photographed without warrants, legal observers being blocked from protest zones. It was no longer a dispute, it was a siege. And every time Starmer spoke, the chasm widened. The countryside wasn't just resisting, it was winning. And Labour wasn't just losing a policy battle, it was losing its soul. Labor tried to de-escalate with words, but the machinery of state repression proved them liars. Meanwhile, Nigel Farage was everywhere. At a protest outside Leeds, standing atop a hay bale, megaphone in hand, thundering, "You grow the food, and they treat you like criminals. No more." On national radio, he grilled Labour spokespeople into silence. On GB News night after night, he exposed each new detail: the surveillance operations, the internal communications, the gag orders placed on dissenting police officers. He wasn't just outraged, he was armed with receipts, and the public took notice. Polls started to shift, not just in favorability, but in momentum. Reform UK, once written off as a protest vote, surged among rural voters, small business owners, and even among disillusioned Labour moderates who had finally had enough. And then came the hammer blow. Labour's own legal counsel, internal, private, and secret, was leaked. A document prepared for Starmer's cabinet laid out the legal risks of continued arrests, detailed the potential breaches of human rights law, and warned of serious consequences if Labour was found to be targeting protesters. Based on political ideology, the phrase used in that document was chilling, a pattern of authoritarian behavior inconsistent with democratic standards. That document should have stayed buried, but Farage got hold of it and he read it live on air. The silence from Labour was deafening, and just like that, the protests became something else. They became a movement no longer just about land or tax or farming, but a cry against top-down control, against technocratic arrogance, against a party that used to fight for workers but now surveilled them, arrested them, and branded them as threats. Town halls began holding emergency meetings. Villages passed symbolic motions declaring no confidence in Labour governance. A group of young farmers launched a grassroots digital campaign titled "We Are Not Your Subjects," and it exploded, garnering millions of views in days and flooding social media with defiance, solidarity, and raw rural anger. Meanwhile, Labour HQ looked like a bunker under siege. Officials leaked that Starmer was furious, isolated, and losing the room. Senior staffers reportedly advised him to walk back the tax, while others pushed for even harder crackdowns. The EA's result was paralysis. Starmer was trapped by his own policies, by his own image, and by a revolt he could neither crush nor calm. And in that vacuum of leadership, Farage stepped in fully, not just as a critic, but as a commander. He didn't just oppose Labour's plan, he laid out a vision: total repeal of the farmland inheritance tax, suspension of all climate-linked regulations until a national referendum could be held, and a new Rural Sovereignty Act protecting farmers' rights to land, protest, and property. He wasn't just feeding the fire, he was building a platform on it. Because this wasn't just about Labour anymore. It was about the soul of Britain, about who gets to decide what this country is. Elitists with spreadsheets and carbon targets, or the people who dig, plant, harvest, and build. Farage made it clear. Labour had chosen a side and the people were choosing theirs. It was supposed to be a quiet reform, a tax adjustment, a green initiative. That's how Starmer's advisors pitched it: a clean, progressive policy to help fund the future, raise revenue, and push Britain into a greener age. But it ended with riot vans, judicial revolts, mass resignations, media meltdowns, and a public awakening that shattered the image of Labour beyond recognition. And in the middle of it all, on the cracked roads between villages, in the fields now crowded with banners and cameras, in Parliament's shadow, and across every digital channel, stood Nigel Farage, holding the line while Labour watched its own narrative burn. As tractors continued to blockade key routes into London, the pressure on Starmer intensified from every direction. Police unions began expressing unease over the orders they were being given. Officers on the ground leaked audio and body cam footage showing they were being told to prioritize optics over fairness. In one clip, a supervisor was heard telling units to contain visible dissent, especially near media. The public backlash was immediate. It wasn't just that Labour was targeting peaceful protesters. It was that they were doing it knowingly, calculatingly, as a matter of political strategy. Not safety, not law, just image management and damage control. Inside the Labour Party, chaos was spreading like rot beneath a floorboard. Meetings turned into shouting matches. Senior advisors clashed over whether to stand firm or issue a public apology. Some warned that backpedaling would look weak. Others warned that not backpedaling would look tyrannical. Starmer, once the man of focus and clarity, now looked indecisive and rattled. He had built his leadership on the illusion of competence, of balance, of being the adult in the room after years of Tory chaos. But under pressure, that mask shattered. Because when Britain needed calm, he chose crackdowns. When people begged for dialogue, he chose surveillance. And when the nation's most honest workers, the farmers, stood up to defend their families, he called in the state to break them down. Leaked WhatsApp messages from Labour insiders revealed internal polling that was setting off alarms. Key rural constituencies were shifting overnight. Reform UK had jumped 10 points in battlegrounds. Worse still, Labour was bleeding support not just to reform, but to no one. Disillusioned voters were walking away entirely. One strategist summed it up in a brutal sentence. "We've woken up the countryside, and they won't forget." And they didn't. Because while Starmer attempted to calm the storm with focus groups and lukewarm promises of reviewing the tax, Farage went straight to the people. He traveled county to county, holding town hall-style gatherings, not as a politician talking down to a crowd, but as one of them, listening, nodding, and speaking plainly. "This is not just about farming," he repeated again and again. "This is about control. Who owns your land? Who decides your future? Who gets to tell you what's fair, and who gets silenced when they disagree?" It wasn't a campaign anymore. It was a revolt, a slow-moving avalanche gathering voices and strength with every passing day. And just when it seemed Labour couldn't sink lower, another judge spoke out. This time, not through anonymous memos, but directly. A retired High Court justice penned an open letter published by major newspapers, warning that the use of police resources against farmers constituted a dangerous erosion of civil liberties in service of ideological compliance. He compared Labour's tactics to soft authoritarianism masked by legal procedure. The public reaction was explosive. Suddenly, it wasn't just Reform UK or Farage making the accusations. It was the judiciary, the legal system, the very backbone of British democratic checks and balances declaring that something had gone terribly wrong. And what was Starmer's response? A press conference carefully staged, emotionally flat, and scripted to death. In a tone devoid of conviction, he reiterated Labour's respect for peaceful protest while refusing to address the arrests, the surveillance, the gag orders, or the crackdown. When pressed, he blamed operational decisions by local authorities. No accountability, no apology, no leadership, just deflection. But the country had already seen too much. More footage emerged. Drone shots of police staging vans outside farms in Norfolk, voice recordings of local councillors receiving veiled warnings not to support protests, emails showing Labour-linked NGOs planning media campaigns to label the protest movement as climate denialist extremism. The narrative collapsed completely. What was left was the truth. A party obsessed with control, out of touch with the people it claimed to fight for, and terrified of any voice that dared speak against its carefully crafted agenda. Meanwhile, Farage didn't just maintain momentum, he escalated. He announced the formation of a rural Britain coalition, uniting farmers, small-town business owners, and disaffected local leaders under a shared banner of resistance. He launched a petition calling for a full public inquiry into Labour's use of state resources against protesters. It gathered over 1 million signatures in days. He demanded a live televised debate with Starmer. Starmer declined. That moment told the country everything they needed to know. One man was willing to defend his beliefs in front of the nation, the other hid behind press releases and party lines, and then came the final blow. The National Farmers Union, long considered neutral, released a devastating statement. In it, they condemned the tax, condemned the arrests, condemned the surveillance, but more than that, they urged all farmers to vote their conscience. It was the closest the NFU had ever come to endorsing an opposition movement. And when asked directly if they were referring to Farage's Reform UK, the union's president simply replied, "We support those who support us." From that point on, the tide became a flood. Labour's climate plan was unofficially put on hold. Senior MPs began distancing themselves from Starmer's inner circle. Internal calls for a leadership challenge surfaced in political circles.